As the Witchfinder General of Salem, Massachusetts, one of the questions I get asked all the time is, how did the witch hysteria of 1692 begin? Now, that's actually a pretty complicated question when you think about it, because what do you mean by begin? Do you mean what started the girls having their fits in the first place? Do you mean what took what should have been a small household level problem and turned it into a county-wide pandemic? Or do you mean what was the flashing point that turned neighbor against neighbor and led to the deaths of at least 20 people? Now, for the sake of this particular video, I am going to focus on just one of these issues, really. I want to start by talking about what caused the girls to have their fits in the first place. What was the inciting incident that would set Salem Village on a path to the death of 20, and actually more, innocent people? As I tell the story, I shall endeavor to keep the scope of this video relatively narrow, for brevity's sake, even though it might not seem like 38 minutes is all that brief. There are several related side stories that I would love to go off on a tangent on and tell you all about, such as what role the adults played in naming the initial suspects, or the baking of Mary Sibley's witch cake, but I shall try to temper my enthusiasm for the subject and stick narrowly to the subject at hand. What caused the girls' fits in the first place? Our story begins here. This is the site of the Salem Village parsonage. The parsonage is a house where a village minister would live. In 1692, Salem Village's minister was Rev Samuel Paris. He was Salem Village's first ordained minister, though there had been other unordained ministers before him. His election as village minister widened an already deep divide between villagers, and the way that he gained his ordination, through some kind of corrupt bargain with the political and financially powerful Putnam family, furthered that divide. Samuel Paris lived in the parsonage with his wife, Elizabeth, and their children, 10-year-old Thomas, 9-year-old Betty, and 5-year-old Susanna. Also living with them were Paris's orphaned 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, and 2, probably, Caribbean Indian slaves, a married couple named Tituba and John Indian. Even before the witchcraft outbreak, the Paris household could not have been a very comfortable place to live. For one thing, the villagers were in very much dispute over the payment of the reverend's salary, and because of this dispute, they often simply didn't pay it. This meant that there was no money for firewood, and this meant, in January of 1692, that this house was rather cold. On top of this, through his sermons and writings, it is very clear that Reverend Paris was very aware that there was a faction in town set to drive him out of the parsonage and out of town. It's not unreasonable to think that he expressed anxiety and frustration over this in the household. And it doesn't take a large leap in logic to assume, then, that he expressed to the children in the household that they must live even more morally upright than any of the other villagers. They have to be shining examples to the community. After all, they were the sons and daughters and orphaned nieces of the minister. Because if they behaved as anything other than the perfect little Puritan children, his enemies would have reason to declare him unfit for his ministry. We also know from his sermons that he was a firm believer in corporal punishment. Now, on top of these specific anxieties, there were also general anxieties that came with living as a Puritan in rural New England at this time. Chief among these was the concern for your eternal soul. The Puritans believed that God had decided whether you would spend eternity in heaven or in hell before the world was even created. It didn't matter what you did in life. Either way, he already made up his mind and you were going to heaven or hell. Now, you may suppose that this would mean that the Puritans were free to live however they wanted because God had already made up his mind, and it doesn't matter whether you're a sinner or a saint. You can do whatever you want. God's already made up his mind. You're going to go to heaven. You're going to go to hell. Party, right? But that's not the way it was. They believed that if you were one of the chosen people, one of the elect, one of the saints, as they would come to be known, then you would naturally live a life fitting with the Puritan ideals and morals of the times. So if you were known to be a sinner, this meant that you were probably not one of the elect. You were probably not going to end up going to heaven. And this would reflect very badly on you and your family. It's kind of a skewed logic, I know, but this is the crowd we're working with. So basically, it was believed that if you demonstrated through your life and through your actions that you were a good Christian, moral, Puritan person, then you were very likely one of the elect who would be going to heaven. But there was really no way to tell for sure. So the fear of hell and the devil was very much real. And by the way, they believed that the devil and demons, these weren't abstract figures like many people consider them today. These were actual beings that could and would visit Earth and wreak havoc in your life. The parsonage children would attend religious services, which they referred to as meetings, at least 3 times a week in the town meeting house, what we might call a church today. Puritans also had something called church, but that was what you called the people who were believed to be elect, these saints, and people would go to the meeting house whether they were members of the church or not. It's kind of a thing for a different video, but just know that church means something different to a Puritan than it does to us. And they're what we would call church today. Their building where they met and prayed and talked about the Bible and all that stuff was called the meeting house. And their services were called meetings. So the children would go to 3, at least, services per week at the meeting house, but then they'd also have religious services at home run by their father, Rev Paris. And this included a Saturday night sermon, which would be like his dress rehearsal for the sermon he was going to give the next day to the town at the meeting house. There was also the constant fear of Indian attacks. Several nearby towns had been raided with Puritan men being slaughtered and their wives and children either being killed as well or carried away to fates unknown, or, at the very best, left to fend for themselves. It is often speculated that the orphaned Abigail Williams became an orphan because her parents were murdered in an Indian attack. There's absolutely no proof in the record that this was the case, but it is at least possible, if not probable. It's also important to understand that the Puritans basically were racist, and they saw the Native Americans, Native people, First Nations, we're going to call them Indians in this series because that's what they were called at the time, and we're flowing with that. The Indians were less than human. They thought they were kind of a subspecies of human, possibly related to the race of Cain, who was the first murderer in the Bible and cursed by God to live out a different life. Now, God said to stay away from these people, and he helpfully set a mark on them, but the Bible doesn't tell us what the mark was. So the Puritans thought that this mark may, in fact, be skin that was a little bit darker than their own. And they thought that it was possible that the Indians had not discovered any form of Christianity, let alone Puritanism, because they were actually demons, essentially, or a race given over to demons, and that they worshipped not God or gods that they claimed to, if they prayed at all, because several Indian tribes did not really have a form of worship. If they had any kind of worship at all, what these people were praying to were not in any way, shape, or form related to Jesus or God the Creator. They were related to the devil and his demons. It's also important to know that at this time, the idea of witches and demonic infestation was nothing new in Massachusetts. There had been witch trials before, and most recently, before this, just a few years earlier, there was a woman named Goody Glover who was tried, convicted, and hanged in Boston for the crime of witchcraft. Her grave is unknown, but it's somewhere on Boston Common. So next time you go to Cheers, take a stroll over, walk over to Frog Pond, and think about the witch buried somewhere nearby, just above the parking garage, perhaps. There was also a case not too long before the 1692 Witchcraft Trials of a 16-year-old girl in Groton who at first claimed to be bewitched, and then when through trials it was discovered that the person she accused could not be the one bewitching her, it was determined that she was in fact possessed by a demon. The devil, it seemed, considered New England his kingdom, and he was willing to fight the Puritans for it. In January of 1692, Abigail Williams began to complain of headaches. Gradually, both she and her cousin Betty began to flinch, as if they feared being attacked by an invisible attacker. Indeed, their fear grew so great that they started hiding under chairs and crawling into holes. But they could not say just what they were so afraid of. At times, they spoke gibberish. At other times, they seemed unable to speak at all. They claimed to feel both dull aches and sharp pains. Sometimes they would suddenly collapse to the floor as if they had no skeleton to support their weight. Other times, their bodies would stiffen rigidly. Other times, they would begin to convulse and writhe on the floor or in their beds. We don't know for certain if any one particular incident served as the spark which lit the flame that would soon engulf all of Salem, but we do have an intriguing clue left to us by Reverend John Hale. Just a few years after the trial had ended, Reverend Hale, who came from Beverly to witness the girls in their first fits and stayed with the trials all throughout, wrote a book about the events of 1692. In it, he claimed that one of the afflicted girls confessed to him that her fits had started after she and another one of the afflicted girls had attempted to divine their own future using a method known as omancy. Omancy is the act of trying to tell your fortune by using the whites of an egg. In order to do it, all you need is a clear glass full of room temperature to slightly warm water and an egg. You have to crack it open and separate the yolk from the whites and pour in just the whites. I am not much of a cook and I don't really break eggs too often, and I certainly don't separate the yolk from the whites. So let's see how I do with this part. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we got enough anyway. And now we wait. Now, in 1692, the girls said they were doing this because the idea is that the formation of whatever the whites form in the egg would be the occupation of your future husband. It seems very similar to games that we used to play when I was a kid. There was a game called MASH where I forget how it works. And I forget even what MASH stood for. It was like marry, something, house, school maybe. I don't know. But it stood for all these things. So sometimes people say that you're supposed to let it sit for hours or overnight or something like that. In 1692, I don't think that was the case. I think they probably did it just the way we're doing it now, where they dropped it in and took a look and saw what they saw. So what do we see? I see a long, straight line. Hale's unnamed confessor stated that when she and her accomplice looked into the egg, they saw the shape of a coffin, symbolizing perhaps an early death. This, plus the knowledge that any form of fortune-telling was considered to be sinful, created great fear in the girls, and it was soon after this that their physical and emotional ailments began. Now, we can't say for certain, but it is probable that the two unnamed girls he's talking about here are Betty Paris, who did the confessing, and Abigail Williams. I don't want to give away the ending of this story, so we're going to pause it there, but we will cover that in another video specifically about Betty Paris and Abigail Williams because they deserve their own full-length video. At first, Rev Paris tried to keep the illness of the children in his household quiet. But in these times, it was customary for parishioners to pay a visit to their minister, either just for general conversation and well wishes, or to seek his counsel. Guests to the parsonage couldn't help but notice the young girls writhing on the floor. This attracted attention, and soon it was the talk of the town. Still, Paris was hoping to find a medical reason why the girls were so afflicted. He must have suspected witchcraft or even demonic possession. But, again, he was worried about his place in town, so he wouldn't want the village thinking that something satanic was happening in his own household. He sought a medical explanation. He called upon several doctors, and eventually one of them came and paid him a visit. Again, we don't know for certain who this doctor was, but there's reason to believe that it was Salem Village's own doctor, Dr. Griggs. He had been, up until very recently, a close neighbor of the parsonage, and he may not have been the most learned man in town. There's reason to believe that he could read, but not write. And what counted as a medical doctor back in 1692 was a little bit sketchy. But there's a good reason to believe that he was the doctor that came to visit, which I will explain in just a moment. Dr. Griggs, presumably, came to the house and examined Betty and Abigail. He could find no medical reason for their distress. And it was he who first declared that the girls must be under, quote, an evil hand. That is to say, they were bewitched. Still wishing to avoid a public calamity that would bring shame to his family, Rev Paris did not take any official legal action to discover who could be bewitching the children. Instead, he asked his family, friends, and villagers to pray for the Paris family and for the relief of these terrible afflictions on Betty and Abigail. It didn't work. The very next day, two more village girls began suffering from the exact same kind of affliction that Betty and Abigail demonstrated. These girls were Elizabeth Hubbard, the live-in niece of Dr. Griggs, and Ann Putnam Jr., daughter of Rev Paris's most ardent supporter, Thomas Putnam. It is very likely that these girls were among the visitors to the parsonage while Betty and Abigail were having their fits. Did the devil follow them home? Did they catch whatever sickness Betty and Abigail had? Or did they notice the attention the girls got and decide to get some of their own? The villagers' concern now grew to the verge of near panic. Even Rev Paris himself admitted that there must be witches at work in Salem. He went to Abigail and Betty and repeatedly demanded that they name the witch who tormented them. At first, the girls refused, saying they could see nobody that was trying to attack them, even though they were flinching and hiding and claiming to be bit and pricked and stabbed all the time. After much prompting and possibly some cajoling, the girls named 3 local women who were bewitching them. The 3 accused were Sarah Good, the frightening local beggar; Sarah Osborne, who was possibly mentally ill; and Paris's own slave, Tituba. We will discuss each of the 3 accused women in a future video, but for now, we're going to pause the narrative right there. We will now turn our attention to some theories as to what could have caused the girls' fits. Now, the action could have been the fortune-telling with the egg, but in most people, this would not cause the kind of reaction, extreme reaction, that we see in this case with Abigail and Betty. So why did these girls react in this way? Well, let's take a look at some theories. The first theory, of course, is that they were actually bewitched, that there were actual witches in Salem, whether they be the 3 that they accused or not, and that they were working magic and tormenting these young girls. That's one theory. That's the theory they had in 1692. But they also had another theory in 1692, and that was that the girls were actually possessed by demons. This was by far the less popular theory, certainly among Paris himself. He had a lot of reason to prefer a witch attacking his family than the devil opening up shop, basically, in his own household. Although he wasn't entirely against the idea of the devil coming after him, because it kind of gave you street cred as a minister, being like, oh, I'm such a good minister to the Lord, and I help so many Christians and create so many Puritans and spread the word and live a gospel lifestyle that that I infuriate the devil. And that's why he's coming after me. So it was kind of like a badge of honor. But even then, you don't want the devil to take root in your own household. But that is a question that came up during the trials. Were the girls bewitched or were they possessed? We're going to get to that in other videos. And the final delusion, which was almost contemporary at the time, towards the end of the trials, this theory became more popular, was that there were no witches and the girls were not possessed by demons, but they were deluded by Satan. This was a delusion. They were fooled by demons or influenced by a demonic spirit into accusing others of witchcraft and leading to their deaths. This is called the delusion of Satan, and we're going to talk about that in more depth in later videos. A theory that I'm really not excited to talk about, but that I will talk about because a lot of you, when you meet me on the streets of Salem, this is one that you want to point out, and it's one that you take a little pride in knowing, and it wraps everything up nice and neat, and we can say, oh, it was this, and then we're done with it, and that is Ergodism. Ergodism, which is a fungus that grows on wheat and can cause hallucinations. And some people say, oh, these girls got a hold of this infested wheat, and it made them sick, and they started hallucinating, and that's what caused this whole thing. Now, to dismiss this theory out of hand is not a good idea. It's something that could have happened and something that we should look at. And I think that the mistake a lot of people who kind of shoot down this theory make is thinking that the people who support this theory are saying that everybody who accused people of being a witch or said that they saw a yellow bird or they saw the devil and they saw all these witches holding their Sabbath meetings, that everybody who said those things was affected with this ergot sickness. But I don't think that's what most of the people who support the theory are saying. I think that they're saying, no. Betty and Abigail had ergot sickness, and from there it became something else, whether it was faking sickness or witchcraft afflictions, or whether it was something else, maybe one of the mental health diseases we're going to be discussing in just a moment. But even then, I still don't really like this theory because there were other people in the house. There were 8 people in the house and only 2 people got sick. Even if you say, well, they're children, their stomachs couldn't handle it, adults maybe could digest it easier and it wasn't really a problem for them. You still have Thomas, the oldest son, who was not affected. He's not mentioned in any of the records as suffering any kind of afflictions, nor 5-year-old Susanna. she was also not affected. Not to mention that none of the adults, with the exception of John Indian, who turns out to be a rather shady character, perhaps forgivably, we'll talk about him in a future video. Are you guys getting sick of me saying that yet? We've got a lot to talk about. I told you, I got a lot of enthusiasm and passion, so much I even talk too fast and I can't get the words out right. Another theory, which I think is very interesting, we have absolutely no proof that this was the case, except possibly the girl's actions. And I don't know enough about it to really have a judgment on it, aside from saying that we don't have any proof that this took place. But the theory is that one or both of the girls was being sexually abused. There's nothing in the record to indicate that, but then again, why would there be? They're not going to say like, oh, by the way, she was abused right before all this started happening by somebody else in the house, one of the adults in the house, or maybe even the older brother. Who knows? But without proof, I don't feel like it's something to give too much credit to, because there are other more reasonable areas that we can look into. But it doesn't hurt to consider and to talk about and to think about. So maybe in a future episode, I will find someone more knowledgeable about the symptoms, a counselor, a therapist, a psychologist, and we can talk about if there's any reason to believe, based on what has been recorded in the record, to believe that they could have been the victims of sexual abuse, and that is where this trauma started for them. But that leads us very nicely into what I consider more likely suspects for what was going on here, and that is mental health issues. Now, if you have studied the witch trials at all, you have probably heard that a lot of people believe the girls were suffering from hysteria, and that this is what broke out throughout the village. Some people might have been faking it, but some people actually had clinical hysteria. The symptoms are almost exactly the same as the kinds of things that we see with the afflicted girls. And they are known to be caused by repression, which, living as a Puritan in New England, these children definitely were repressed in many ways. And we don't just mean sexually there. In many ways, they weren't allowed to play. Anything that was fun was basically considered, at the very best, a temptation to sin. If not sinful in and of itself, it was like it could possibly lead you to sin. It could lead you to choose doing something fun over something that you were supposed to do. So that would be a form of repression. It was also, hysteria was also known to spread between females in a tight-knit community. Somehow it didn't generally happen to men, with the exception of soldiers returning from the world wars. PTSD, shell shock, as they would have called it at the time. But there's just one problem with this theory from strictly a medical standpoint, and that is that hysteria is no longer recognized as a medical diagnosis. So, what would the modern day equivalence of hysteria be? What could it be? It's actually, it presents as several different things. Now, I am not a clinician of any kind, but my day job actually is in the mental health sector, and I've worked it for longer than some of you have probably been alive. So I do know a little something about this, but I'm certainly no expert. So if you are a clinician or a doctor and you have more information on this and you think that it might be useful to these videos, go ahead, leave your comments below or shoot me a message, and maybe we can talk in the future. So here are some things that I've discovered that could possibly be the causes. The first is an actual disorder called fictitious disorder. If you believe the girls are all faking, everybody was faking the entire time, this could be what we're talking about here. Fictitious disorder is, I'm sorry, I got to read this from my notes because I don't have the exact 100% information in my brain reading from the notes. A person deliberately fabricates or exaggerates physical or psychological symptoms because they are getting some type of reinforcement from being sick. Symptoms could be any number of things, and they could be completely faked, like pretending to have thrown up, like someone comes out of the bathroom and they say, oh, I just threw up, but no one saw it, and you don't know for sure that it happened. Or it could be induced, meaning you take some Epicac and make yourself throw up or something like that. So you have the actual symptom, but you brought it on yourself, and it's not due to whatever you're claiming it's due to. An important point to emphasize is that people with fictitious disorder do not actually suffer the symptoms that they claim, and they also do not fear that they will suffer these symptoms. So they're not actually throwing up because of an illness, and they also aren't afraid that they're actually going to get sick. It's usually motivated by the attention and the sympathy that they get from others. And what's very interesting is that this can happen without the person with fictitious disorder even knowing that that's the underlying reason why they're doing it. The brain's a tricky thing, man. It is not motivated by external rewards, such as getting out of household chores, or getting to miss meetings, or getting to make some kind of money off of being sick, or, like you're not getting Social Security or something like that. This is the major difference between fictitious disorder and our next mental health suspect, malingering. Malingering is when a person deliberately fakes physical or mental health symptoms to gain material goods. This is not actually a disorder, it's what you would call a condition. Unlike fictitious disorder, the person is faking illness in order to get material goods, money, and just a way of avoiding work or going to meeting. So that's if you feel that the girls were in some way, in whole or in part, faking. But what if they weren't faking it? Then we have somatic disorder. A person who suffers actual physical and or mental symptoms, but there is no medical reason why they should be suffering these symptoms. Specifically, they may have something known as conversion disorder. This person has real symptoms, and they are not faking them. They are actually happening, they have no control over it, and they are not faking it. But there is an incompatibility between the symptoms being observed and any medical diagnosis or mental health diagnosis that the person has. It is commonly believed that symptoms are a physical manifestation of a buried emotional trauma. Symptoms can include tremors, seizures, garbled speech, or the complete loss of the ability to speak, partial or complete paralysis. People with conversion disorder often also suffer from major depression and or post-traumatic stress disorder. Sufferers also tend to have a history of maltreatment and extreme personality traits often seen in people with personality disorders. This is very interesting when you think about someone like Abigail Williams, who had extreme personalities, and again, not a clinician, but I have a feeling, based on the record, that she had a little something going on up here that maybe wasn't able to be treated quite correctly in 1692. So that is where our conversation ends for this video. This is, like I said, was just specifically about those first fits and what caused them. I think a good theory is they were fortune-telling because of the way that they were brought up and the repression that they had, possibly because of trauma, especially Abigail Williams, who seems to be the first one to have shown symptoms. Who knows why she was orphaned? It could have been Indians. It could have been any number of things, but just growing up without parents, who knows for how long. She lived with Paris since he moved into the parsonage, so she'd been there several years. But who knows exactly what was going on. But I feel like something bad had happened or was happening to Abigail Williams. And then also the repression of just being a Puritan, being a girl, a young girl in this society, having reached the age where she was expected basically no longer to be a child. Now it was time she'd be basically a full-grown woman in their concept of, the circle of life. And I think that those, in combination with the great fear that she would have had of committing a sin and then seeing a coffin in the egg yolk, I think that could be enough to trigger something like conversion disorder or something like it. Again, if you're a clinician or a doctor and you have other thoughts and opinions and feelings on anything that I'm saying, comment below, let me know, hit up your boy, and we can discuss it perhaps on a future episode. Speaking of future episodes, I would love to hear from you guys, so please comment below and tell me what other subjects you want to talk about next. I'm not going to give you an A to Z of the witchcraft trials. Well, we might end up there, but that's not my intention as I start out. I just want to pick through the things that I find very interesting. So I think probably next time I will talk about 2 of the first 3 accused women, because Tituba deserves her own video. We're going to get to her. And that will probably be the next one. But what else do you guys want to know about? Let me know. And I will try to tell you. We'll compare the Crucible to history. We will definitely going to talk about Mary Sibley and that witch cake. And there's so many topics that we could go on and on about. Now, the reason I'm doing these videos is because normally at this time of year, I grow out this mustache and everything because I'm a street performer in Salem. But this year, with coronavirus, hi, it's 2020 if you're watching this in the future, there's no street performing in Salem. And that's bad news for me because that means I'm not making any money on street performing. So, if you enjoyed this video, if you want to see the series continue, and if you want to support the Witchfinder, then I invite you to go to gofundme.com/witchfinder20 and give generously, just like you would if I was on the street. Now, I'm not looking for big money, and I'm not asking for something for nothing. You can go ahead and leave $1. That's fine. That's how we do it on the street, dollar by dollar. And I know that this is like the worst time in history to be asking for money, but again, I'm not asking for a lot. Any little bit that you can give would be a great help, and keep that Witchfinder going. You can follow me on Instagram at Witchfinder of Salem, and I guess that's it for now. So until next time, beware, the Witchfinder is always watching. I'm sure you noticed, but we actually had a celebrity cameo happening the entire video. Anyone know who this is? This is somebody's life mask. Can you name it? Can you name this celebrity?